6 days after we moved into our new house, the previous owner called me. Her voice was shaking. She said she forgot to disconnect one security camera in the living room. She told me she saw my husband and his mother doing something to my drink. "Do not tell him," she whispered. "Come alone." The phone almost slipped from my hand. My name is Paige. I am 33 years old and I work as a forensic accountant. I always thought numbers were the only things that could be manipulated. I had no idea my entire marriage was a carefully calculated fraud. If you have ever trusted the wrong person, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe because you will want to see exactly how I dismantled their lives. Before I could even process Beatrice's warning, the kitchen door swung open. I quickly ended the call and shoved my phone into my pocket, forcing my breathing to slow down. My husband Gavin walked in wearing a crisp designer shirt and his signature charming smile. He looked exactly like the successful entrepreneur he claimed to be. In his hands, he carried a steaming mug of herbal tea. He set it on the marble island in front of me with a soft thud. "Drink up, sweetheart," he said, kissing the top of my head. "You have been so forgetful lately. Mom brewed this just for you. She said it will help clear your mind." I stared down at the dark liquid swirling in the mug. For the past 6 days, ever since we moved into this $2.5 million Tudor mansion in Westchester, Patricia had been making me this special tea. And for 6 days, I had been experiencing crippling brain fog. I was losing my keys, forgetting entire conversations, and sleeping for 12 hours straight, only to wake up feeling completely drained. I leaned in slightly and caught a faint, bitter metallic scent beneath the heavy aroma of chamomile. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my training as a risk analyst kicked in immediately. I needed to act normal. I reached for the mug with a trembling hand, allowing my fingers to slip just as Gavin leaned in close. The hot liquid splashed directly onto his chest, ruining his $400 silk shirt in seconds. Gavin cursed loudly, jumping back from the counter. "What is wrong with you?" He snapped his charming facade, dropping instantly to reveal a flash of genuine anger. Before I could even offer a fake apology, the sharp click of expensive heels echoed in the hallway. His mother, Patricia, marched into the kitchen. She took one look at her son's stained shirt and turned her furious gaze on me. "Can you not even hold a simple cup?" she sneered, crossing her arms over her cashmere sweater. "You can take the girl out of a cramped apartment in Queens, but you simply cannot teach her class. I suppose we should be grateful you did not ruin the hardwood floors this time." Patricia had spent the last 3 years of my marriage making sure I knew I was entirely beneath them. She paraded her Westchester socialite status like a weapon, constantly reminding me that I was just a working-class girl who got lucky when her son proposed. What she did not know was that I had secretly inherited a $50 million trust fund from my late grandfather. Gavin and Patricia thought I was barely scraping by on a standard corporate salary, heavily reliant on Gavin's supposed business success. They thought I was a vulnerable target. I looked at the puddle of tainted tea on the floor, then calmly opened my leather briefcase resting on the counter. I pulled out a crisp piece of paper and slid it across the kitchen island toward her. "Speaking of ruining things, Patricia," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "This is the $5,000 replacement invoice for the Persian rug in the dining room. The one you ruined with your red wine last night because you were too careless to use a coaster. The supplier requires payment within 24 hours. You can make the check out directly to me." Patricia's jaw clenched, the color rapidly draining from her perfectly contoured face. She opened her mouth to argue, but I did not give her the chance to formulate a defense. I grabbed my car keys from the counter, my posture radiating complete authority. "I need to run to the office to grab some financial files," I forgot I announced, stepping right past them. "Have the cleaning service handle this mess, and Gavin, maybe change your shirt before it stains permanently." I walked out to my car, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. I did not drive to my office in the city. I drove straight to the affluent neighboring suburb where Beatrice had relocated. Beatrice was a sharp-witted 65-year-old widow who had sold us the house. When she opened her front door, her face was pale and drawn. She led me straight to her home office without saying a single word and pointed a trembling finger at her laptop screen. I sat down in the leather chair, my blood running absolutely cold as she hit play on the captured footage. The hidden camera angle showed my new living room in crystal clear high definition. I watched as Gavin and Patricia stood by the wet bar, completely unaware they were being recorded. My loving, devoted husband was holding a small plastic bag filled with heavy prescription pills. Patricia handed him a heavy stone mortar and pestle. I watched in absolute horror, my stomach turning as the man I married systematically crushed the high-grade psychiatric sedatives into a fine powder. He laughed with his mother, a cold and calculated sound as they stirred the heavy dose into my morning tea. The video kept playing on Beatrice's laptop, pulling me deeper into a nightmare I never knew I was living. I watched my husband, the man who vowed to protect me, tap the edge of a heavy stone mortar to loosen the last bits of white powder into my favorite ceramic mug. Patricia leaned against the marble kitchen counter, swirling her own glass of expensive red wine. She looked at Gavin with a chilling, predatory smile. "Once the doctors declare her mentally unfit, I get full conservatorship," Gavin said on the recording. His voice was completely casual, as if he were discussing their weekend golf plans at the country club rather than the destruction of my life. "Her $5 million trust fund is ours. We can finally pay off the offshore accounts before those guys come looking for blood." The words hit me like a physical strike. My chest tightened and the air in Beatrice's home office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. My entire 3-year marriage had been a carefully orchestrated predatory financial trap. Gavin had not married me out of love or shared ambitions. He had married a balance sheet. He had likely hired private investigators before we even met at that charity gala, digging into my background and uncovering the trust my late grandfather had left me. But as the shock washed over me, a dark, sharp sense of irony cut through the rising panic. Gavin was a terrible businessman, and clearly he had hired terrible investigators. He thought my trust fund was worth $5 million. He had no idea that through my own quiet investments and my grandfather's original principle, the trust was actually worth $50 million. He was poisoning his own wife for pennies on the dollar. Beatrice placed a gentle, shaking hand on my shoulder. "I can call the police right now, Paige. We have them on tape. We can have them arrested before dinner." I shook my head, my mind already shifting from the role of a betrayed victim to the cold, calculating mindset of a forensic accountant. "Do not call anyone yet," I told her, keeping my gaze locked on the frozen image of my husband's smiling face on the screen. "If we call the police now, they will just get arrested for tampering with a beverage. Gavin has expensive corporate lawyers on retainer. They will spin it. They will say it was just herbal supplements, a mix-up, or a misunderstanding to help me sleep. I need them to fall into a trap they can never crawl out of." I asked Beatrice to transfer the video file directly to my secure encrypted cloud drive. I thanked her profusely, warning her to keep her doors locked, to set her alarm system, and to pretend we had never spoken today. Walking back to my car, I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for people who had lost the game. I was just getting started. The 20-minute drive back to the Westchester mansion gave me time to build my persona. If Gavin and Patricia wanted a confused, mentally deteriorating wife, I was going to give them an Oscar-winning performance. I pulled into the driveway of the massive Tudor estate and let myself into the house, deliberately dropping my car keys onto the entryway table with a loud, clumsy clatter. I walked toward the back of the house and froze in my tracks. The heavy oak door to my private home office was wide open. Inside, Gavin was frantically rummaging through my mahogany desk drawers. Confidential files were scattered across the expensive Persian rug, and my secure lockbox had been pulled out from its hidden compartment. He was desperately looking for my financial documents, trying to locate the exact account numbers for the trust fund he planned to steal. "Gavin, what are you doing in here?" I asked, keeping my voice shaky, breathless, and uncertain. He spun around, completely unfazed by being caught red-handed. His face melted instantly into an expression of deep, patronizing concern. He walked over, stepping on my scattered papers, and gently grabbed my shoulders. "Paige, sweetheart. I was looking for your spare car keys. You left the gas stove burner on full blast before you left for the office." The flame was reaching the cabinets. The whole kitchen could have caught fire. I stared at him. I had not even entered the cooking area before I left. He had turned the stove on himself to build his twisted narrative. I turned it off. I stammered, raising a hand to rub my temple, mimicking the intense brain fog I was supposed to be feeling from the drugged tea. I swear I turned it off, Gavin. I checked it twice. He sighed heavily, pulling me into his chest. It is okay, baby, but this is getting worse. Yesterday you forgot your own sister's phone number. Today you almost burned our brand new house down. You are under too much stress at work and your mind is slipping. We need to face facts. He was gaslighting me right to my face. He was actively constructing a false reality where I was a massive danger to myself, laying the groundwork for the corrupt doctors he undoubtedly planned to bring in. I let my shoulders slump, resting my head against his chest, listening to the steady lying beat of his heart. I do not know what is happening to me, I whispered, forcing a slight pathetic tremor into my voice. I feel so confused all the time. My head is constantly spinning. Gavin stroked my hair, his touch making my skin crawl with absolute revulsion. We will get through this, he murmured smoothly into my ear. But we need to be smart. We need to protect you from yourself. He stepped back, reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket, and pulled out a thick, legally bound document. He guided me to the desk chair, forced me to sit down, and pressed a heavy luxury pen into my trembling hand. What is this? I asked, staring at the dense legal jargon printed on the first page, pretending I could not comprehend the words. I had my lawyer draft a medical proxy, Gavin said softly, his voice dripping with fake devotion and manufactured worry. Just in case your memory gets worse, or if you have an episode where you cannot make decisions for yourself. It just gives me the ability to handle your medical care and basic accounts, so you do not have to stress about the details. Sign it for my peace of mind. Peace. The tension in my dining room the following evening was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing a lavish dinner, playing the role of the dutiful, scatterbrained wife to absolute perfection. Gavin and Patricia sat on one side of the massive mahogany table, practically glowing with the secret knowledge that my signature was on their fraudulent legal document. They had no idea that the ink had already evaporated into thin air inside Gavin's hidden safe. Sitting across from them were my sister Vanessa and her husband Kendrick. Vanessa and I had grown up sharing a tiny bedroom in Queens, fighting for every single opportunity we ever got. She was fiercely protective of me, grounded and completely immune to the high society manipulation that Patricia constantly weaponized. Kendrick was an entirely different kind of force. A brilliant black man who had grown up in Brooklyn, he had spent a decade as a ruthless federal prosecutor before becoming a top-tier corporate attorney in Manhattan. He was a man who put corrupt executives behind bars for a living. He sat quietly at the table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, analyzing every single micro-expression that crossed Gavin and Patricia's faces. Kendrick already knew about the poisoned tea and the disappearing ink. We were simply waiting for the enemy to make their next move. Patricia did not make us wait long. She set her crystal wine glass down with a sharp, deliberate clink that silenced the room. She leaned forward, putting on a mask of deep manufactured sympathy. Vanessa. I am so glad you and Kendrick could join us tonight. Patricia began, her voice dripping with fake concern. We really need to have a serious family discussion about Paige. I am sure you have noticed how her mind has been slipping lately. The forgetfulness, the confusion, the erratic behavior. It is becoming quite a burden on Gavin. Vanessa stiffened, her protective instincts immediately flaring up. My sister is the sharpest person I know, Patricia. I have no idea what you are talking about. Oh, please do not be defensive, Patricia sighed, placing a hand on her chest. We are just trying to get her the help she so desperately needs. Gavin has been a saint dealing with her episodes. It makes me wonder, does early onset dementia or some sort of psychological instability run in your family's bloodline? I know medical care in those working-class neighborhoods you girls grew up in is not the best. Perhaps something was missed during her childhood. The sheer audacity of her classist insult hung in the air. Gavin nodded along sorrowfully, reaching over to pat my hand. We are looking into scheduling a full psychiatric evaluation for her next week, he told my sister, looking like the perfect, tragic husband. It is for her own safety. Vanessa opened her mouth to tear them both apart, but I caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. It was my turn to play. I gently pulled my hand away from Gavin. I offered Patricia a bright, polite smile, reaching down to the leather briefcase I had tucked beneath my dining chair. Speaking of evaluations, Patricia, I said, my voice completely clear and devoid of any fake confusion. I actually did a little evaluating of my own this morning. I pulled out a thick printed financial ledger bound in a black folder and placed it squarely in the center of the dining table. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to look for irregularities. I continued watching the smug satisfaction slowly drain from Patricia's face. I noticed some highly unusual activity regarding your personal charity foundation. It seems your recent charity donations are bouncing. In fact, the accounts are entirely overdrawn. Gavin frowned, leaning forward. Paige, what are you talking about? Stop talking nonsense and put those papers away. I did not break eye contact with Patricia. Her face was turning an alarming shade of gray. I am not talking nonsense, Gavin, I said smoothly. I am talking about the $300,000 Vegas casino marker your mother racked up last month. Did you really mortgage your luxury yacht through a shell company just to pay off a gambling syndicate, Patricia? Because according to these wire transfers, you have been embezzling funds from your own nonprofit organization to cover the interest payments. The silence that slammed into the dining room was deafening. The facade of the wealthy, untouchable Westchester socialite shattered into a million pieces right in front of my eyes. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at the ledger on the table as if it were a venomous snake. Gavin's face turned a violent dark shade of red. The charming, caring husband completely vanished, replaced by the desperate, cornered predator I had seen on the hidden camera footage. He pushed his chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. He stood up, towering over the table, and slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany wood. "Shut your mouth!" Gavin roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his physical intimidation tactics on full display. I do not know what fake documents you printed out, but you are not going to sit in my house and disrespect my mother. You are sick in the head, Paige. You are completely delusional, and I am going to have you locked up. Before Gavin could take another step toward me, Kendrick moved. My brother-in-law did not shout. He did not stand up. He simply picked up his glass of red wine, took a slow, deliberate sip, and leveled a gaze at Gavin that was so intensely cold it stopped my husband dead in his tracks. Gavin Kendrick said, his deep voice slicing through the room with absolute terrifying authority. If you raise your voice at my sister-in-law again while she exposes federal tax fraud, I will personally dial the IRS Criminal Investigation Division from this table. And trust me, they love it when former federal prosecutors hand them an embezzlement case tied up with a neat little bow. The morning after the disastrous dinner party, the silence in the Westchester mansion was heavy and thick. Gavin had barely slept. He spent the entire night pacing the hardwood floors of our bedroom, completely terrified by Kendrick's threat to involve federal tax investigators regarding his mother. By 6 a.m, Gavin threw on a wrinkled suit, grabbed his keys, and sped out of the driveway without saying a single word to me. His panic was palpable, and his sudden departure gave me the exact window of opportunity I desperately needed. Beatrice's hidden camera had been a stroke of pure luck, but as a forensic accountant, I knew that luck was not a reliable strategy. I needed a systematic, airtight web of surveillance to capture every single mistake my husband was about to make. I grabbed my purse, drove straight into Manhattan, and visited a high-end tactical electronics store. Using cash from a secure account Gavin knew absolutely nothing about, I purchased 6 voice-activated microtransmitters. These were not cheap commercial recording devices. They were the exact same models used by private corporate investigators to expose insider trading. When I returned to the empty mansion, I moved with absolute precision. I taped one transmitter deep under the steering column of Gavin's imported luxury SUV. I slipped another behind the heavy velvet headboard in our master bedroom. Finally, I unscrewed the metal grating of the air conditioning vent directly above his mahogany desk in his private home office, placing the most sensitive microphone right where he conducted his daily business. I was building a digital cage around my husband, and I knew he was arrogant enough to walk right into the center of it. The waiting game ended faster than I expected. That evening, Gavin returned home looking pale and utterly exhausted. He poured himself a massive glass of bourbon from the wet bar and immediately locked himself inside his office. I walked down the hall to my own study, locked the door behind me, and slipped on a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I connected them to my encrypted cloud server and waited. Within 10 minutes, the audio feed from his office crackled to life. Gavin was making a phone call. A man answered on the other end. He did not introduce himself, but his thick, gravelly voice was laced with an undeniable quiet violence. The man demanded to know why a massive offshore wire transfer had not cleared the syndicate's accounts. He told Gavin that patience was no longer an option. He said that if the debt was not settled by the end of the month, Gavin would be leaving New York in the trunk of a car. My husband's voice trembled so badly, I could barely recognize it. He sounded like a terrified child. He begged the debt collector for a 1-week extension. I listened as Gavin frantically pitched his twisted, predatory lifeline. "You do not understand," Gavin pleaded into the phone. "My wife is having a severe mental breakdown. Her mind is completely gone. I already have the medical proxy signed. In exactly 7 days, the doctors are coming to the house. She is going into a permanent private psychiatric facility. The second she is locked away, I have full legal authority to liquidate our assets. I will sell the Westchester estate immediately and wire you the funds. Just give me 7 days. I swear you will get every single penny." The man on the phone hung up without confirming the extension, leaving Gavin breathing heavily into the silence of his office. Sitting in my study, I felt a brief chill crawl up my spine, but it was quickly obliterated by a sharp, analytical focus. My husband was planning to sell a $2.5 million Tudor mansion to pay off a violent gambling syndicate. But from a purely financial perspective, his plan made absolutely no sense. Even with a medical proxy liquidating a primary residence that was jointly owned to cover unverified personal debts would trigger a mountain of red flags during any standard real estate underwriting process. Title companies would freeze the transaction instantly, unless, of course, he had already leveraged the property. My fingers flew across my keyboard. As a financial risk analyst, navigating public records and uncovering hidden liabilities was second nature to me. I opened a secure browser and logged directly into the county clerk public database for real estate transactions. I typed in the address of our Westchester property to run a quiet title search. It took me less than 5 minutes to find the smoking gun. A secondary deed of trust had been recorded against our home just 3 weeks ago. The lender was not a traditional bank. It was an obscure, shadowy shell company known for issuing high-interest, predatory, hard money loans to desperate borrowers who needed fast cash without regulatory oversight. The principal loan amount was exactly $1.5 million. I downloaded the scanned PDF of the mortgage agreement and scrolled rapidly down to the signature page. There was Gavin's signature signed in bold, arrogant blue ink. Right beneath it was my own name. The signature was a meticulous, nearly perfect forgery of my handwriting. Beside our names sat a fraudulent notary stamp heavily blurred but officially recorded by the county. Gavin had bypassed the entire traditional banking system, forged my signature, and illegally extracted $1.5 million in equity from our home to feed his offshore gambling addiction. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and pulled my headphones off. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or heartbreak. Instead, a profound, exhilarating sense of victory rushed through my veins. Gavin thought he was just being a ruthless, manipulative husband. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of domestic chess by drugging his wife and trying to steal her inheritance. But his desperation had made him sloppy. By forging my signature on a highly regulated real estate document and using electronic communications to wire those illicit funds, he had crossed a massive, inescapable legal threshold. He had just handed me the rope to hang him with. He had committed aggravated mortgage fraud and federal wire fraud. I stared at the forged legal document glowing brightly on my high-resolution monitor. I imagined Gavin sitting just a few rooms away, thinking he was the smartest person in the house. He was planning to lock me in a psychiatric ward, completely unaware that he had just bought himself a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I printed the forged loan document, tucked it into my leather briefcase, and drove straight into Manhattan. I bypassed my own corporate building and headed directly to the sleek, towering glass high-rise, where my brother-in-law Kendrick worked as a senior partner. Kendrick was a brilliant corporate attorney and a former federal prosecutor who had built his entire career dismantling financial criminals. Walking into his corner office overlooking the Hudson River, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I slid the printed hard money loan agreement across his massive glass desk. Kendrick picked up the document, his dark eyes scanning the text with practiced speed. I watched his jaw tighten as he zeroed in on my forged signature at the bottom of the page. He looked up, his expression shifting into the cold, predatory focus that used to terrify witnesses in federal court. Gavin actually did it, Kendrick said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He bypassed the traditional banking system to secure $1.5 million from a shadow lender, and he committed multiple federal felonies to get the cash. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him, crossing my legs. He thinks he is going to sell the Westchester house next week to pay them back. He promised the debt collector he would have me committed to a private psychiatric ward so he could assume full control of my assets through the medical proxy. Kendrick leaned back, steepling his fingers. Gavin is arrogant, but he lacks legal foresight. He assumed you were a naive target. He did not account for the fact that you analyze corporate fraud for a living, and he definitely did not account for me. We are going to build a financial fortress around that property right now. Kendrick turned to his dual monitors and began rapidly drafting a new legal document. We executed a quitclaim deed. We legally transferred my full ownership stake of the Westchester property into a blind shell company called Vanguard Holdings. Kendrick and I had secretly established Vanguard Holdings months ago as a protective measure for my sister Vanessa and my own private investments. By executing this transfer immediately and recording it with the county, we effectively stripped Gavin of any legitimate claim to the property. More importantly, because Gavin had forged the mortgage documents with an unregulated lender, his illegal lien was now attached to a property that no longer belonged to us as a married couple. The loan was entirely unsecured. When Gavin eventually tried to sell the house or default on the payments, the lenders would discover the fraud. He was completely trapped in a financial vice of his own making. With the property legally shielded and the paperwork filed, I drove back to Westchester. I walked through the front door, slipping easily back into the persona of the confused, exhausted wife. I let my shoulders slump and rubbed my temples, expecting to find the house quiet. Instead, I walked into the living room and froze. Gavin was sitting on the expensive velvet sofa. Beside him sat a man in his late 40s, wearing a cheap tweed jacket holding a clipboard. The man had a kind, patronizing smile plastered across his face, but his eyes were darting nervously around my expensive living room. "Paige, sweetheart, come sit down," Gavin said, standing up and using his softest, most manipulative tone. "I brought someone to meet you. This is Dr. Evans. He is a private behavioral specialist. I asked him to come by for a brief, informal chat, just to help you with these memory gaps you have been struggling with." I stared at the man on the couch. This was Gavin's escalation. He was bringing the ambush directly into my home, trying to fast-track my fake diagnosis so he could seize my trust fund and pay off his violent creditors. I walked over and sat in the armchair opposite them. I folded my hands in my lap, portraying a picture of perfect, quiet compliance. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Evans," I said, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. The man nodded, clicking his pen. "Hello, Paige. Gavin has told me you have been feeling very disoriented lately. Leaving the stove on, forgetting important documents, experiencing severe paranoia. I am just here to do a basic assessment. Nothing to worry about. We just want to get you into a safe residential care facility where you can rest." I looked at his clipboard. The paper was mostly blank. I looked at his cheap shoes, his poorly fitted jacket, and the distinct lack of a hospital badge. Gavin was drowning in debt. He could not afford a real, highly regulated psychiatrist to risk their medical license on a fraudulent diagnosis. He had hired a scammer. I took a deep breath, dropping the confused wife act instantly. I sat up perfectly straight, my posture shifting into the commanding presence of a senior corporate analyst. Dr. Evans. I said, my voice suddenly sharp, crisp, and ringing with absolute authority. Before we continue this assessment, I need you to provide your National Provider Identifier number for my personal medical records. I also need to see your board certification credentials and your active state licensing documentation. The man blinked, his patronizing smile faltering. Excuse me. You heard me. I continued, leaning forward. Furthermore, since you are conducting an unsolicited psychiatric evaluation in my private residence, I require a signed HIPAA compliance waiver disclosing exactly who is paying for your services. Are you billing my insurance, or is Gavin paying you under the table in cash? Gavin stood up, his face flushing with panic. Paige, stop acting crazy. Dr. Evans is just trying to help. I ignored my husband completely, locking my eyes onto the sweating man on the sofa. I am a forensic accountant, Dr. Evans. I track financial crimes and regulatory compliance. So you should know that conspiring to commit conservatorship fraud by issuing a fabricated medical diagnosis is a direct violation of Title 18 U.S. Code, Section 1347. It carries a penalty of up to 10 years in federal prison for healthcare fraud. If you write a single word on that clipboard, I will personally hand your name over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation before dinner. The fake doctor swallowed hard. The color drained from his face entirely. He looked at Gavin, panic flashing in his eyes, realizing he had walked into a trap. He was expecting a heavily drugged, hysterical housewife. He got a stone-cold corporate professional instead. Look, there has been a misunderstanding, the man stammered, shoving his pen into his pocket and standing up so fast he nearly knocked over the coffee table. I am not conducting a formal evaluation. I am just leaving. He practically sprinted toward the front door, ignoring Gavin calling his name. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, rattling the walls of the mansion. Gavin stood in the center of the living room, breathing heavily, staring at me as if he were looking at a complete stranger. I stood up, smoothed down my skirt, and offered my husband a polite, chilling smile. I am feeling much better now, sweetheart. I think I will go make dinner. I walked upstairs to my private study and locked the door. I pulled out my secure tablet and logged into the hidden surveillance network I had installed throughout the house. I accessed the feed from the micro-transmitter hidden in Gavin's office. A few moments later, my screen captured an incoming text message notification mirroring from Gavin's phone. I clicked the image and read the frantic text from his hired fraudster. She is not crazy. She is dangerous. I am out. I sat in my locked study, staring at the glowing screen of my secure tablet. The text message from the fake doctor blinked back at me in stark, glowing letters. She is not crazy. She is dangerous. I am out. Through the audio feed from the microtransmitter I had hidden inside the air conditioning vent of Gavin's office, I listened to my husband's immediate reaction. There was a moment of dead silence, followed by the violent, shattering crash of a heavy glass tumbler being hurled against the hardwood floor. Gavin let out a guttural scream of absolute frustration. His quick, dirty solution to seize my trust fund had just blown up right in his face. He was a desperate man backed into a financial corner, and his next move was entirely predictable. He needed to blow off steam and numb his panic. I heard him stomp down the hallway, grab his car keys from the entryway table, and slam the heavy oak front door behind him. I pulled up the GPS tracking software linked to the transmitter I had taped under the steering column of his luxury SUV. A small red dot blinked on my digital map, moving rapidly away from our Westchester estate and heading straight toward his exclusive country club. Gavin was going to drink. He would be sitting at that mahogany bar for at least 2 hours, drowning his anxiety in expensive scotch. That gave me a perfectly clear window of opportunity. I left my study and walked down the quiet hallway to Gavin's home office. The room smelled of spilled bourbon and desperation. I ignored the shattered glass on the floor and walked directly to the false bookshelf panel built into the far wall. Behind a row of hollowed-out encyclopedias sat a heavy biometric steel safe. Gavin assumed his secrets were impenetrable, but he fundamentally misunderstood how a forensic accountant operates. We do not break down doors. We look for the patterns you leave behind. I pulled out my phone and accessed the audio files from the hidden microphone above his desk. I isolated the recording from the previous night precisely when Gavin had opened the safe to retrieve the blank power of attorney document. I boosted the audio levels and put on my noise-canceling headphones. I listened closely to the electronic beeps of the keypad. Each number on a standard digital lock emits a slightly different frequency. I matched the distinct acoustic tones to the slight wear patterns on the rubberized buttons. 482901. I punched the 6 digits into the keypad. A bright green light flashed and the heavy locking mechanism clicked open with a smooth mechanical thud. I pulled the heavy steel door wide open. The safe was packed with disorganized financial chaos. I reached inside and pulled out thick stacks of paper. They were not investment portfolios or corporate contracts. They were heavy, high-interest debt markers from underground, unregulated casinos operating out of Macau and Monaco. Gavin did not just owe $1.5 million to the local loan shark who held the forged mortgage on our house. According to these offshore ledgers, my husband was currently underwater for over $4 million to international gambling syndicates. He was a dead man walking, and I was his only remaining life raft. I set the ledgers aside and reached deeper into the dark cavity of the safe. My fingers brushed against something small wrapped tightly in a thick rubber band. I pulled it out into the light. It was a cheap black prepaid burner phone. The screen was dark. I held the power button down, and the device booted up immediately. There was no password protection, no biometric lock, just a simple swipe screen. Gavin was incredibly arrogant, confident that no one would ever breach his physical safe. I opened the messaging application. There was only one active conversation thread logged under an unsaved, untraceable phone number. I began to scroll back through the message history. The dates jumped from recent months to a year ago, and then further back, landing exactly 4 years into the past. This was the exact timeline when Gavin's first wife, Rebecca, had died. Her death had always been framed as a terrible, unavoidable tragedy. The story Gavin told everyone, including me, was that Rebecca had lost control of her car on a patch of black ice while driving down a steep mountain road during a brutal winter storm. As I read the text messages glowing on the cheap screen, the blood in my veins turned entirely to ice. The message from the unsaved number read, "The line is severed cleanly. The brake fluid will drain out slowly over 10 miles. By the time she hits the decline, she will have zero stopping power. It will look exactly like she lost control on the black ice." Gavin's response sat right below it, sent 4 years ago. "Make sure she takes the steep route down the mountain road tonight. Send me the offshore routing number when the job is done." I stopped breathing. The air in the room felt heavy and suffocating. This was no longer just a case of severe financial fraud. This was not just a greedy, manipulative husband trying to drug his wife and steal a $50 million trust fund to pay off his gambling debts. I was standing in the home office of a cold-blooded murderer. Gavin had hired a mechanic to cut the brake lines on his first wife's car. He had orchestrated her violent, terrifying death just to collect a massive life insurance payout. A payout he had inevitably blown at the baccarat tables in Macau, leading him directly to me and my hidden inheritance. I stared at the burner phone, my mind racing through the sheer magnitude of the criminal conspiracy I had just uncovered. I needed to get this physical phone to Kendrick immediately. We needed to hand this device directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But before I could even move, the cheap plastic device vibrated sharply against the palm of my hand. The screen illuminated the dim office with a harsh, glaring light. A new incoming text message had just arrived from that exact same unsaved number. I looked down at the screen, my heart pounding a frantic warning rhythm against my ribcage. The message read, "Does the new wife need a brake check too? Same price as last time." The glowing screen of the cheap burner phone stared back at me in the dim light of Gavin's office. "Does the new wife need a brake check too? Same price as last time." My blood ran colder than ice, freezing the breath in my lungs. Gavin was not just trying to steal my $50 million trust fund anymore. He was actively coordinating my murder. If his plan to lock me in a psychiatric ward failed to secure his payout, he already had a violent, fatal backup plan waiting in the wings. I took a steadying breath, pulled out my secure tablet, and photographed the text message exchange. This was the final nail in his coffin, the ultimate piece of evidence Kendrick would hand over to his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I carefully placed the burner phone right back into the steel safe exactly where I found it. I locked the heavy biometric door, wiping away any trace of my fingerprints. I needed to stay alive long enough to see him rot in a federal prison, and tonight was my opportunity to strike the first massive blow. That evening was the annual Westchester Heritage Charity Gala. It was the premier social event of the season, packed with billionaire hedge fund managers, powerful local politicians, and old money socialites. It was also the exact highly public venue Gavin and his mother Patricia had chosen to orchestrate my mental breakdown. Their strategy was maliciously simple. They wanted me to lose my mind in front of the city's elite, creating a room full of wealthy, credible witnesses who could testify to my sudden insanity. I dressed meticulously for the occasion. I wore a stunning floor-length emerald green gown, standing tall and projecting the image of a flawless, supportive wife. Gavin hovered uncomfortably close to me all night. He played his part to perfection, whispering sweet manipulative lies into my ear, while his eyes darted nervously around the grand ballroom. He was waiting for his mother to initiate their sick, calculated plan. My sister Vanessa and my brother-in-law Kendrick were also in attendance, standing discreetly near the grand staircase. Kendrick caught my eye from across the room and gave a single firm nod. The trap was set. About an hour into the event, I excused myself to visit the restroom, deliberately giving my husband and his mother the window of opportunity they needed. But I did not walk down the hall. Instead, I slipped behind a massive cascading floral arrangement near the wet bar, keeping a clear, unobstructed line of sight to our high-top table. Patricia approached the table holding two elegant crystal flutes of vintage champagne. I watched closely as she turned her back to the crowded dance floor, shielding her hands from view. With a practiced sleight of hand motion, she pulled a small vial from her sequined clutch. She tipped a heavy dose of white powder directly into the glass on the left. It was not a mild sedative this time. Based on the amount, it was a heavy, potent hallucinogen designed to trigger an immediate and violent psychotic episode. The powder dissolved instantly into the bubbling liquid. She gave the crystal stem a gentle swirl, her face contorted in a dark, triumphant smile as she set the glasses side by side. I waited exactly 30 seconds in the shadows, smoothing down my silk dress and pasting a serene, clueless smile onto my face before emerging from the crowd. As I approached our table, Patricia picked up the glass on the left and held it out toward me. "Here you go, Paige, dear," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Drink up. You have looked so incredibly stressed lately, and we just want you to relax and enjoy this beautiful evening." I took the glass from her hand, holding it delicately by the crystal stem. "Thank you, Patricia," I said, keeping my gaze locked directly onto hers. "You are always looking out for my well-being. It really means everything to me." Gavin stepped up right behind me. He placed a heavy restraining hand on the small of my back, physically positioning me so that everyone in our social circle would have a front-row seat to my inevitable collapse. But I was not the naive working-class girl from Queens they thought I was. I was a forensic financial risk analyst, a woman trained to anticipate immediate threats and redirect them with absolute precision. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted the perfect distraction. State Senator Hastings, a major political player Patricia had been desperately trying to network with for months to secure board positions for her fake charities, was walking directly past our table. "Oh, Patricia," I said, pitching my voice slightly higher to grab her attention with sudden excitement. "Is that Senator Hastings over there by the ice sculpture? I thought you said he declined the invitation to the gala tonight." Patricia whipped her head around instantly, her social climbing instincts totally overriding her focus on the poisoned drink. Gavin also turned his head, eager to spot the powerful politician and plan his networking approach. They looked away from the table for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds was all the time I needed. With a smooth, seamless motion I had practiced mentally all afternoon, I slid my spiked champagne flute onto the table directly next to Patricia's identical glass, and in the exact same breath I picked hers up. The swap was entirely flawless, completely invisible in the dim romantic lighting of the ballroom. I brought the clean glass back to my chest just as Patricia turned back around to face me, an eager, predatory gleam in her eyes. "He is heading this way," Patricia said breathlessly, quickly grabbing the tainted glass from the table, completely unaware of what had just transpired right under her nose. "Let us toast to family before he gets here." "To family," I echoed softly, raising the clean champagne flute high in the air. Patricia tipped her head back and swallowed the heavily spiked champagne in one long, greedy gulp, completely unaware that she had just ingested enough hallucinogens to shatter her own mind. I rode in the back of the ambulance holding Patricia's manicured hand while she thrashed wildly against the heavy leather medical restraints. The paramedics had to administer a massive dose of clinical sedatives just to stop her from clawing at her own face and screaming about imaginary insects. Gavin followed closely behind us in his luxury SUV, frantically calling his public relations team to contain the catastrophic social fallout of his mother's highly public drug-induced psychotic break. As they wheeled Patricia through the sliding glass doors of Westchester Medical Center, I smoothly intercepted her sequined designer clutch from a distracted paramedic. I told him I was her daughter-in-law and would keep her personal belongings completely safe. Sitting in the stark, fluorescent-lit waiting room, my emerald green silk gown felt entirely out of place. The sharp scent of antiseptic burned my nose, grounding me in the reality of my absolute victory. Gavin was pacing at the far end of the corridor, furiously arguing with the hospital administrator, desperately throwing money around to keep Patricia's admission off the public record. He was distracted, panicked, and completely oblivious to me. I opened the sequined clutch, shielding it with my body. I found cash, premium credit cards, and a compact mirror. Then my fingers brushed against a heavy, gold-plated lipstick tube. It felt incredibly dense, unusually solid for a cosmetic product. I twisted the base, but no red pigment appeared. Instead, the bottom cap popped off with a quiet metallic click, revealing a hidden micro USB drive. I pulled out the secure, ultra-thin tablet I always carried, concealed in my own evening bag. I plugged the drive in my heart, maintaining a steady, calculating rhythm. The files were not even encrypted. Patricia was arrogant enough to believe her high society status made her entirely bulletproof, assuming no one would ever dare search her personal belongings. I opened the master spreadsheet and my eyes rapidly scanned the columns of data. It was an absolute masterpiece of financial deception. Patricia had been systematically embezzling millions of dollars directly from the Westchester Heritage Charity Foundation. She was creating fake vendor invoices for non-existent event planning companies and consulting fees, funneling the charity donations from the city's wealthiest elites into a complex maze of offshore shell companies. And the final destination for all that stolen money was incredibly clear. Wire transfers were bouncing from the Cayman Islands straight to Macau. She was bleeding her own prestigious nonprofit dry just to keep Gavin's violent gambling creditors from breaking his legs. I initiated a secure encrypted data transfer, copying every single file, invoice, and routing number directly to my private cloud server. I now held the key to utterly destroying Patricia's entire social and financial existence. I slipped the USB drive back into the lipstick tube, dropped it into the clutch, and slid my tablet away. I stood up and walked down the quiet, sterile hospital corridor to find my husband. I did not have to look far. Gavin stepped out from a dim concrete stairwell, cutting off my path entirely. His charismatic, polished facade was completely gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair was disheveled, and a thick vein pulsed angrily in his neck. His timeline was entirely destroyed. He had promised the loan sharks he would have me locked in a psychiatric ward tonight so he could steal my trust fund. Instead, his own mother was the one strapped to a hospital bed, raving like a lunatic. The walls were closing in on him, and he knew it. He lunged forward and grabbed my upper arm. His grip was vicious, his fingers digging bruisingly deep into my flesh. The sudden physical violence was a stark reminder that this man had ordered the murder of his first wife. "You did this!" Gavin hissed, his breath hot and smelling of stale champagne in pure panic. "I do not know how you did it, but you switched those glasses. You think you are so smart, Paige. You think you can play games with me and win. You have absolutely no idea what I am capable of. I will ruin you. I will tear your entire life apart and leave you with absolutely nothing." He pulled me roughly toward the heavy metal door of the concrete stairwell, his intentions turning distinctly dark and violent. He needed to silence me, and he was desperate enough to do it right there in the hospital. I planted my feet, refusing to show him a single ounce of fear. Before he could drag me another inch, the heavy metal doors of the elevator bank slid open with a soft melodic chime. My sister Vanessa and her husband Kendrick stepped out into the corridor. Kendrick took one look at Gavin's hand aggressively gripping my arm, and his entire demeanor shifted instantly. The polite brother-in-law vanished, replaced by a predatory, battle-hardened federal prosecutor. He crossed the distance between us in 3 massive, purposeful strides. Kendrick grabbed Gavin's wrist with one hand and effortlessly twisted it backward, breaking my husband's violent grip in a fraction of a second. Gavin stumbled backward against the wall, rubbing his wrist in shock, his bravado instantly evaporating in the face of a man who was significantly larger and vastly more powerful. Kendrick towered over him, adjusting his suit jacket with cold mechanical precision. His dark eyes blazed with absolute terrifying authority. Assaulting a woman in a hospital corridor filled with security cameras, Kendrick said, his deep voice echoing dangerously off the linoleum walls. "Let us see how that holds up in federal court." Patricia was securely locked away in the psychiatric wing of Westchester Medical Center, heavily sedated and completely discredited. Her high society friends were already whispering about her catastrophic meltdown at the charity gala. But while Patricia was neutralized, my husband Gavin was a cornered animal. His strict deadline with the underground gambling syndicate was rapidly approaching. He owed over $4 million to violent offshore creditors, and his illegal $1.5 million mortgage on our home was a ticking time bomb. Gavin desperately needed to prove to his lenders that he was in absolute control of my financial assets. He needed a public stage to finalize his narrative. 2 days after the gala, Gavin walked into the kitchen. His eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled of cheap cologne and intense stress sweat. He forced a wide, artificial smile onto his face. "Paige, sweetheart," he said, keeping his voice carefully soothing. "I know this week has been incredibly difficult. With my mother in the hospital and your memory issues getting worse, we need something positive. I have decided to host a grand housewarming and resilience party this Saturday." I looked up from my tea, pasting a blank, vulnerable expression onto my face. "A party?" I asked softly. "Are you sure that is a good idea right now?" He stepped forward and gripped my shoulders, his fingers digging into my skin just a little too hard. "It is a perfect idea. We will invite the entire neighborhood, our corporate partners, and the local politicians. We need to show everyone that we are a strong, united front. I am going to make a special toast to you. I will announce that you are taking a temporary medical leave at a private wellness facility, and I will show everyone the power of attorney you signed. It will prove I have everything under control." He was practically vibrating with desperate arrogance. Gavin actually thought he could use our wealthy guests as credible witnesses to my forced institutionalization. He planned to wave that legal document in the air, signaling to any loan sharks hiding in the crowd that my $50 million trust fund was officially his for the taking. "That sounds wonderful, Gavin," I whispered, looking down at the marble counter. "I will wear my red dress. I will do whatever you think is best." The second Gavin left the house to meet with the caterers, my fragile housewife persona evaporated completely. I locked myself in my study and initiated a secure video call with my sister Vanessa and my brother-in-law Kendrick. The time for gathering intelligence was officially over. It was time to go on the offensive. I transmitted the high-resolution photographs I had taken of Gavin's secret burner phone directly to Kendrick's encrypted law firm server. The images clearly showed the text messages between Gavin and the mechanic who had intentionally cut the brake lines on his first wife's car. I also sent over the digital copies of the forged hard money loan agreement and the offshore gambling ledgers I had pulled from Patricia's hidden flash drive. Kendrick reviewed the files, his face an unreadable mask of pure legal focus. The man was a former federal prosecutor, and he knew exactly how to build a cage that no expensive defense attorney could ever break. This is aggravated mortgage fraud, international wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder across state lines, Kendrick said, his deep voice radiating absolute terrifying authority. Gavin has left a digital and financial footprint a mile wide. If he tries to sell that house or default on that loan, the blind shell company we set up will trigger a massive federal flag. Are you ready to hand it all over? Vanessa asked, her voice fierce and highly protective. I nodded, staring directly into the camera lens. Take him down. Kendrick did not waste another second. He packaged the entire dossier into a secure, heavily encrypted digital file. He did not call the local police departments. Local cops could easily be swayed by Gavin's immense wealth and social status. Instead, Kendrick bypassed the local authorities entirely and forwarded the undeniable evidence directly to his former colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Manhattan. The federal agents had the supreme jurisdiction and the firepower to completely dismantle Gavin's life. The wheels of justice were officially in motion, and my husband was completely blind to the avalanche coming his way. Saturday morning arrived with bright, deceptive sunshine pouring through the massive windows of the Westchester estate. The catering trucks were already parked in the driveway, unloading silver trays and expensive floral arrangements. The entire house was buzzing with hired staff preparing for the grand event. I sat at my vanity mirror in the master bedroom, carefully applying a bold, dark red lipstick. I looked calm, collected, and utterly lethal. Down the hall, I could hear the heavy, frantic footsteps of my husband. Gavin had locked himself inside his private home office. He was preparing his ultimate weapon for the evening. He desperately needed the medical proxy and the financial power of attorney I had signed days ago to prove to his creditors that he held the keys to my entire kingdom. Through the audio feed from the hidden microtransmitter above his desk, I listened to his every single move. I heard the electronic beeps of his biometric safe, 482901. I heard the heavy steel mechanism click open with a solid mechanical thud. Gavin rustled through the stacks of unpaid gambling debts and offshore ledgers. He let out a harsh, relieved breath as his fingers finally found the thick, legally bound folder his high-priced lawyers had drafted. He pulled the document out and flipped it open to the final signature page. I sat completely still at my vanity, staring at my own reflection, waiting for the exact moment the brutal reality of his situation shattered his brain. When Kendrick had given me that specialized thermal fading ink pen, he guaranteed that the chemical compound would vanish completely after 24 hours at room temperature. The ink was specifically designed for secure legal sting operations. It left absolutely no residue, no indentations, and no trace that a signature had ever existed on the page. Through my earpiece, the silence in Gavin's office stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. Then a low, panicked gasp escaped his throat. I heard the frantic, desperate sound of paper being flipped, shaken, and smoothed out against the mahogany desk. Gavin was staring at the bottom line of the legal document. He was staring at the exact spot where my signature was supposed to guarantee his salvation and his wealth. But the paper was completely, flawlessly blank. Hours passed and the sun slowly set over the manicured lawns of Westchester. The mansion filled with the soft sounds of a classical string quartet and the lively clinking of crystal champagne flutes. The elite of New York society poured into my living room. There were billionaire hedge fund managers, local politicians, and all of Gavin's corporate investors. The room was also packed with Patricia's wealthy socialite friends, all of whom were whispering eagerly about her recent catastrophic, psychotic break at the charity gala. Gavin worked the room like a seasoned politician. He shook hands, patted backs, and projected the image of a brave, devoted husband holding his family together through a tragic medical crisis. He thought he was the smartest man in the building. He was completely blind to the financial and legal trap tightening around his throat. I stood quietly near the grand entryway, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the guests mingle. My sister Vanessa and my brother-in-law Kendrick arrived shortly after 8, blending seamlessly into the crowd of high society guests. Kendrick wore a sharp tailored suit. He met my eyes from across the room and gave a single subtle nod. The federal agents were on standby. The financial traps were fully locked. Every single piece of the board was exactly where it needed to be. The heavy brass doorbell chimed softly over the ambient noise of the party. The hired butler opened the massive front doors to welcome the next arrival. A distinguished woman stepped into the bright foyer, handing her expensive wool coat to the attendant. She looked around the opulent space with a sharp, knowing gaze. It was Beatrice, the sharp-witted widow who had sold us this house just weeks ago. Gavin had no idea who she was or why she was walking into our home, but I had secretly added her to the VIP guest list this morning. Beatrice walked directly toward me, her eyes flashing with quiet, undeniable victory. She reached into her designer handbag and subtly tapped a small metal flash drive resting inside. The final weapon was officially in the building. I took the small metal flash drive from Beatrice. Her hands were warm, and her eyes burned with the exact same righteous fire that fueled my every move. I whispered a brief word of gratitude and slipped the device deep into the concealed pocket of my crimson gown. Beatrice gave me a curt nod, turned around and vanished smoothly into the sea of expensive silk and tailored suits, filling my massive living room. The final piece of my trap was securely in my possession. I wove my way through the crowd of New York elite. Waiters in crisp white uniforms carried silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne past billionaires, hedge fund managers, and powerful politicians. I completely ignored them all. I made a direct line for the audiovisual control board tucked discreetly behind the grand staircase. Gavin had rented a state-of-the-art projector and a massive drop-down screen for the evening planning to display a slideshow of his fake philanthropic achievements to dazzle his investors. I plugged Beatrice's flash drive into the main terminal. With a few quick keystrokes, I bypassed his presentation folder and queued up my own highly encrypted media files. I grabbed the small black remote clicker and kept it hidden securely in the palm of my hand. The sharp, piercing clink of a silver spoon striking a crystal champagne flute rang out across the grand living room. The classical string quartet stopped playing their instruments immediately. The low, buzzing murmur of wealthy socialites and corporate executives faded into absolute silence. I stepped out from behind the staircase and looked toward the center of the room. Gavin stood perfectly positioned beneath the cascading crystal chandelier. He looked incredibly handsome, appropriately tragic, and utterly exhausted. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, but he had intentionally loosened his tie to project the image of a man carrying the weight of the world. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Gavin began, his voice echoing through the silent mansion. He let out a heavy manufactured sigh that traveled perfectly through his microphone. "I called this a housewarming and resilience party because, as many of you know, my family has been tested beyond measure this past week." A wave of sympathetic murmurs rippled through the crowd of aristocrats. Everyone in that room knew about Patricia losing her mind at the charity gala. Gavin was playing right into their morbid curiosity. "My mother suffered a sudden, severe medical crisis." Gavin continued, bowing his head slightly. "But tragedy rarely strikes just once. As a husband, my first duty is to protect my home and my wife. But sometimes protection means making the hardest decisions a man can ever make." I watched from the edge of the crowd. Across the room, my sister Vanessa looked like she was ready to leap across the coffee table and rip Gavin's throat out. Her husband Kendrick stood right beside her like an immovable mountain. Kendrick placed a single calming hand on Vanessa's shoulder. His dark eyes locked onto Gavin with the cold, calculating stare of a predator watching its prey step blindly into a snare. Gavin looked up, scanning the crowd until his eyes locked onto me in my striking crimson dress. He stretched his hand out toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, fabricated agony. "My beautiful wife Paige has been suffering in silence," Gavin announced to the breathless room. "Her mind has been rapidly deteriorating. The memory loss, the severe paranoia, the delusions. It has broken my heart to watch the woman I love slip away from reality. I have tried to manage her care privately, but her condition has become a danger to herself and to others." He paused, wiping away a fake tear from the corner of his eye. The performance was sickeningly flawless. "Tonight," Gavin declared, his voice trembling with fake sorrow, "Paige will be leaving this home. I have arranged for her to take an indefinite medical leave at a highly secure private psychiatric wellness facility. It is the only way to get her the round-the-clock care she so desperately needs." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the living room swung open. Two massive men in cheap, ill-fitting suits stepped into the foyer. They did not look like medical professionals. They did not wear hospital badges or carry medical equipment. They had thick necks, broken noses, and cold, dead eyes. These were hired thugs muscle Gavin had pulled from his underground loan shark connections, brought in to physically drag me out of my own home if I dared to put up a fight. The crowd parted nervously as the two massive men walked forward, standing like stone gargoyles just a few feet away from me. Gavin reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick legal folder. He held it up for the entire room of investors and politicians to see. "Because Paige's mind is failing," Gavin said, projecting his voice loudly, "she has agreed to sign a full medical and financial power of attorney tonight. This document ensures her assets are protected and her care is fully funded while she recovers. Paige, sweetheart, please come up here." He was trying to force me to sign away my $50 million trust fund in front of 100 credible witnesses. He thought the hired thugs would terrify me into submission. He thought I was broken. I did not tremble. I did not cry. I gripped the remote clicker in my hand, squared my shoulders, and walked right through the center of the crowd. My crimson dress flowed around my legs like liquid fire. I stepped up beside my husband, completely ignoring the two thugs hovering nearby. Gavin held out a gold pen, offering it to me with a tragic, encouraging smile. I did not take the pen. Instead, I reached out and smoothly intercepted the microphone right out of Gavin's hand. He blinked in surprise, his fingers grasping at empty air. I turned to face the crowd of billionaires, socialites, and corporate titans. I offered them a bright, radiant, and absolutely chilling smile. "Thank you, Gavin, for that incredibly touching eulogy of my sanity," I said, my voice ringing with total, unshakable authority over the speakers. But before I leave, I actually prepared a short video to celebrate our marriage. The silence in the grand living room was absolute. 100 pairs of eyes shifted from the heavy legal folder in my husband's hand directly to my face. I stood bathed in the warm glow of the crystal chandelier, my crimson silk dress sweeping the hardwood floor, holding the microphone with a perfectly steady grip. Gavin stared at me, his charming, tragic mask slipping just enough to reveal the raw panic bubbling underneath. He reached out to grab the microphone back, his fake smile returning as he tried to laugh off my interruption, but I took a smooth, deliberate step backward. I remained completely out of his reach. I raised my left hand, revealing the small, black remote clicker I had kept concealed against my palm. Without breaking eye contact with the man who had orchestrated a hit on his first wife and tried to slowly poison me, I pressed the main button. Behind Gavin, the massive automated projector screen glided down from the ceiling with a quiet, mechanical hum. A second later, the state-of-the-art projector flared to life, casting a bright, harsh, rectangular glow across the entire room. The high-definition footage from Beatrice's hidden camera filled the massive screen. The video was crystal clear, capturing the exact layout of the very living room we were currently standing in. On the screen, a digital version of Gavin walked over to the wet bar. His mother, Patricia, followed closely behind him. I watched the elite crowd react in real time. The wealthy socialites, the hedge fund managers, and the local politicians all leaned forward, initially confused by the domestic scene playing out before them. Then the digital version of Patricia reached into her designer handbag and pulled out the heavy plastic bag of prescription sedatives. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the audience as the video showed Gavin accepting the pills. The surround sound system captured the sickening grinding noise of the heavy stone mortar and pestle. The high society guests watched in absolute paralyzed horror as my husband laughed with his mother, crushing high-grade psychiatric drugs into a fine powder and stirring them into my morning tea. I looked at the real Gavin standing just a few feet away from me. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening hollow shade of gray. His jaw hung slack. He looked back at the screen, then at the crowd, then at me. The thick, heavy legal document he had tried to force me to sign slipped from his sweating fingers and hit the floor with a dull smack. Even the two massive hired thugs standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. They exchanged nervous glances and slowly began backing away toward the foyer. They were hired to handle a hysterical housewife, not to be accomplices to a documented premeditated poisoning in front of 100 highly credible witnesses. They quietly slipped out the front door, leaving Gavin entirely unprotected. But I was not finished. The visual evidence of the poisoning was enough to destroy his social standing, but I needed to completely obliterate his financial and legal existence. I pressed the remote clicker a second time. The video of the kitchen faded to black. In its place, a simple audio wave form appeared on the screen, pulsing brightly in time with a new recording. It was the audio file I had captured using the micro-transmitter hidden inside the air conditioning vent of his private home office. The audio echoed through the mansion, crisp and undeniable. It was the recording of Gavin making his desperate phone call to the violent underground debt collector. The gravelly voice of the loan shark filled the room, demanding to know why the massive offshore wire transfer had not cleared the syndicate's accounts. Then my husband's voice played over the speakers. His recorded voice trembled with pathetic, naked fear. He sounded like a terrified coward, completely stripping away any illusion of the powerful, wealthy entrepreneur he pretended to be. "You do not understand," Gavin's recorded voice pleaded through the high-end speakers washing over his horrified business investors. "My wife is having a severe mental breakdown. Her mind is completely gone. I already have the medical proxy signed. In exactly 7 days, the doctors are coming to the house. She is going into a permanent private psychiatric facility. The second she is locked away, I have full legal authority to liquidate our assets. I will sell the Westchester estate immediately and wire you the funds. Just give me 7 days. I swear you will get every single penny." The dead silence that followed the recording was heavier than gravity. The elite crowd recoiled as if Gavin were suddenly radioactive. His corporate partners stared at him with unmasked disgust, realizing their investment funds were likely tied up in offshore gambling rings. Patricia's high society friends covered their mouths in shock, realizing the depth of the depravity they were witnessing. The narrative Gavin had spent all night building, the tragic story of a devoted husband caring for his mentally unstable wife, was brutally and publicly executed. Everyone in that room now knew that my mental breakdown was manufactured, the medical proxy was a weapon of theft, and the entire housewarming party was a desperate cover-up for his massive, violent gambling debts. As a forensic accountant, I knew that exposing a fraudster to the law was effective, but exposing them to the very society they worshipped was an absolute death sentence. Gavin finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. Pure adrenaline-fueled panic took over his brain. His eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on the audio-visual control board tucked behind the grand staircase. He realized that if he could rip the main cables out of the wall, he could stop the presentation and kill the power. With a wild, animalistic shout, Gavin lunged forward, charging aggressively through the crowd toward the control board. He was desperate, violent, and completely out of his mind with fear. He shoved a waiter aside, sending a tray of champagne crashing to the floor, but he never made it to the cables. My brother-in-law Kendrick stepped squarely out from the crowd and directly into Gavin's path. The towering black former federal prosecutor did not flinch. Kendrick planted his feet and crossed his arms over his tailored suit, standing like an immovable, terrifying wall of pure legal authority, completely and effortlessly blocking my husband from taking another step. Gavin hit a literal wall of muscle and tailored wool. Kendrick did not move a single inch. My husband, completely unhinged by panic, tried to aggressively shove his way past to reach the audiovisual cables. Kendrick simply reached out with one massive hand, grabbed Gavin by the lapels of his charcoal suit, and shoved him violently backward. Gavin stumbled over his own feet and crashed hard into a cocktail table. A silver tray of crystal champagne flutes shattered onto the hardwood floor, sending shards of glass flying in every direction. "Do not take another step," Kendrick warned. His voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute terrifying authority of a former federal prosecutor who was entirely ready to put a man in the ground. The silence in the grand living room was completely suffocating. The elite crowd of New York billionaires, powerful politicians, and wealthy socialites stood paralyzed. They had just watched a high-definition video of my husband and his mother poisoning my drink, followed by an audio confession of Gavin plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my inheritance. I walked slowly to the center of the room, my crimson silk dress gliding softly over the floor. I looked down at Gavin, who was kneeling in a puddle of spilled champagne and broken crystal, breathing heavily. He looked like a cornered rat. I reached into the concealed pocket of my dress and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. I held it up high so the bright light of the chandelier illuminated the text for the entire room to see. My husband told his violent offshore debt collectors that he was going to sell this $2.5 million estate to pay them back, I announced to the horrified crowd. He thought he could secure a $1.5 million hard money loan against this property. He even forged my signature on the primary deed to get the cash. I looked directly at Gavin, letting a cold, victorious smile spread across my face. But Gavin made a fatal amateur miscalculation, I said, my voice ringing with the sharp precision of a financial risk analyst. He did not know that this house does not belong to me, and it certainly does not belong to him. My brother-in-law and I executed a blind quitclaim deed weeks ago. This property belongs entirely to Vanguard Holdings, a private shell company that I legally control. Gavin stared at me, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horror as the realization finally hit his brain. By forging my signature on an unregulated loan attached to an asset we do not even own, I explained to the captivated audience, Gavin did not just make a bad financial decision. He committed federal wire fraud and aggravated mortgage fraud. The money he owes to the underground gambling syndicate is completely unsecured. He has absolutely nothing to give them. He is entirely broke. A collective gasp rippled through the room. But I was not finished. I needed to burn the entire family legacy to ash. I turned my attention to the cluster of wealthy socialites who regularly attended Patricia's exclusive luncheons. The financial rot in this family does not stop with my husband, I continued. Your good friend Patricia is currently strapped to a bed in a psychiatric ward because she accidentally drank the heavy hallucinogens she meant for me. But before she left behind a trail of incredible financial crimes. I found her hidden ledgers tonight. Patricia has been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from the Westchester Heritage Charity Foundation. The socialites gasped again, their faces twisting in genuine outrage. I watched as women wearing diamonds worth more than luxury cars clutched their pearls in disgust. She created fake vendor invoices and dummy consulting firms. I told them, making sure every word hit like a physical blow. Your generous charity donations were not going to underprivileged communities or local hospitals. They were being wired directly to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Patricia was stealing your money to pay off Gavin's underground baccarat debts in Macau and her own massive casino markers in Las Vegas. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly brutal. These were people who protected their money and their public reputations above absolutely all else. The billionaire hedge fund managers who had invested millions into Gavin's tech startups immediately pulled out their phones. They were furiously texting their legal teams and wealth managers to freeze all joint accounts and sever all professional ties before the morning bell rang on Wall Street. Gavin pushed himself up from the wet floor. His hands were bleeding slightly from the broken champagne flutes, staining the cuffs of his expensive white shirt. He looked around the massive living room, making desperate eye contact with his most lucrative business partners. He held out his hands silently, begging them for help, pleading for someone to intervene. Every single person in that room took a deliberate step backward. They created a wide, empty circle of total isolation around my husband. Gavin was no longer a tragic, devoted hero caring for a sick wife. He was a toxic, radioactive liability. He was a financial predator who stole from his own investors and a violent criminal who poisoned his own family. He was completely and utterly alone. Gavin dropped to his knees, burying his face in his bleeding hands. The arrogant, manipulative facade he had worn for 3 years was completely obliterated. I stood over him feeling a profound, intoxicating sense of absolute justice. I had taken every weapon he tried to use against me and turned it into a financial guillotine. Then a faint sound pierced through the heavy, suffocating tension in the room. It started as a low, piercing wail in the far distance, cutting sharply through the quiet night air of the affluent Westchester suburb. The sound grew louder, multiplying into a chorus of urgent sirens tearing down the street. I turned toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the front driveway. The harsh, aggressive strobe of red and blue lights began to bounce off the glass panes, sweeping across the dark lawn and painting Gavin's terrified face in the undeniable colors of federal justice. The harsh, aggressive strobe of red and blue lights swept across the grand living room, painting the terrified faces of New York's elite in alternating flashes of neon. The heavy brass handles of the massive Tudor front doors rattled violently before being thrown completely open. This was not a quiet, polite knock from the local county police. This was a highly coordinated tactical breach. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets stormed into the foyer. Their heavy boots thudded against the imported marble floors, a sound that instantly shattered whatever remained of the high society illusion Gavin had tried to build. The crowd of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and powerful politicians practically climbed over one another to get out of the way. They parted like the Red Sea, pressing themselves flat against the walls and the expensive artwork. Nobody with that much offshore wealth wanted to be caught standing anywhere near the center of a federal raid. Gavin was still kneeling in the puddle of spilled champagne and broken crystal. He looked up at the armed agents flooding into his home, and the last remaining shred of his arrogant, charismatic facade melted off his skull. His face contorted into an expression of pure, primal terror. His hands shook so violently that the blood from the glass cut smeared across his expensive charcoal trousers. My brother-in-law Kendrick stepped forward from the shadows. The towering black attorney smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit and walked directly toward the lead federal agent. Kendrick did not look like a guest at a party. He looked like the seasoned, battle-hardened federal prosecutor he had spent a decade being. He exchanged a brief professional nod with the lead investigator, silently confirming that the target was secured and the perimeter was locked down. Kendrick turned around and walked slowly toward Gavin. He stopped just inches away from my kneeling husband, looking down at him with an expression of absolute freezing contempt. Gavin held up his bleeding hands, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Kendrick, wait," Gavin pleaded, looking around the room frantically. "This is a misunderstanding. This is just a marital dispute. Paige is not thinking clearly. You are a lawyer, you have to tell them to back off. We can figure this out privately." Kendrick did not blink. He did not show a single ounce of mercy. "There is nothing left to figure out, Gavin," Kendrick said, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the silent, breathless room. "The digital evidence has already been processed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Your offshore routing numbers, your encrypted text messages, and your forged real estate documents have all been authenticated." The lead federal agent stepped up beside Kendrick, pulling a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. Gavin, Kendrick announced, delivering the words with the sharp, lethal precision of a falling guillotine. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated mortgage fraud, and conspiracy to defraud a financial institution." Gavin let out a wet, desperate sob. He looked at me, his eyes wide and begging. "Paige, please," he whimpered. "Tell them to stop. I am your husband. I love you. We can fix this." I stood there in my crimson silk dress, my posture perfectly straight, my face a mask of stone-cold indifference. I did not say a single word. I simply watched him drown. But Kendrick was not finished. He leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to Gavin's sweating, terrified expression. And Kendrick continued, dropping the volume of his voice into a dangerous, lethal register that sent a chill through the entire room. "You are also under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit murder across state lines regarding the intentionally tampered brake lines on your first wife's vehicle." The word murder hit the crowd of socialites like a physical shockwave. The financial crimes had disgusted them, but the revelation of a cold-blooded, premeditated assassination absolutely horrified them. Several women covered their mouths to muffle their gasps. The corporate investors who had previously championed Gavin now stared at him with pure revulsion. Gavin's eyes widened to an impossible degree. The realization finally hit his brain. He knew exactly what that charge meant. He knew I had picked the lock to his biometric safe. He knew I had read the messages on his secret burner phone. He realized that for the past week, while he thought he was brilliantly manipulating a confused, mentally unstable housewife, I had been systematically dissecting his entire criminal existence. He let out a visceral, animalistic scream of defeat as the lead federal agent grabbed his shoulders, hauled him roughly to his feet, and forced his arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed loudly through the silent, vaulted living room. Just as the agents began to turn Gavin toward the front doors to begin the perp walk, a sudden chaotic commotion erupted in the entryway. The federal agents stationed at the door tried to block the entrance, but a woman aggressively shoved her way past their arms, practically tumbling into the foyer. It was Patricia. My mother-in-law had apparently just signed herself out of the psychiatric ward against medical advice. She looked entirely deranged. Her expensive designer dress was heavily wrinkled. Her hair was a chaotic, tangled mess, and the wild, frantic remnants of her hallucinogenic breakdown were still burning brightly in her wide, unhinged eyes. She had missed my entire presentation. She had no idea that her massive charity embezzlement had just been exposed to all of her high society friends. She had no idea that the house belonged to a blind shell company. Patricia took one look at her golden child Gavin standing in the center of the living room wearing federal handcuffs. Instead of asking what was happening, her narcissistic brain immediately locked onto the only target she had ever cared about destroying. She turned her wild, bloodshot eyes directly onto me. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my face, her voice rising into a shrill, deafening screech that grated against the walls of the mansion. "You did this!" Patricia screamed, her chest heaving as she spat the words across the room, completely convinced she still held the upper hand over a poor working-class girl from Queens. "You think you can ruin my son? You are nothing but a delusional, pathetic liar. You are broke. You have absolutely nothing without us." Patricia threw her head back, her deranged shrieks echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the massive foyer. The absolute delusion in her voice hung heavily in the air. She stood there in her wrinkled designer dress, her hair an unhinged bird's nest, completely convinced she still held the high ground. The heavily armed federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, glancing at this hysterical woman who had just crashed their tactical raid. The billionaire guests pressed themselves tighter against the walls, completely appalled by the spectacle. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood in the center of the grand living room, my crimson silk dress glowing fiercely under the crystal chandelier. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles outside danced across my face. I looked at the woman who had spent the last 3 years making my life a living hell, the woman who had mocked my working-class upbringing and actively helped her son poison my body. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the hardwood floor cut through the tense silence of the room. I walked right up to Patricia, stopping just 2 feet away from her frantic, shaking form. You have spent the entirety of my marriage calling me a charity case. Patricia, I said, keeping my tone deadly calm and ringing with absolute authority. You love to remind me that I came from a cramped apartment in Queens. You thought I was a naive, desperate girl who was lucky to be saved by your wealthy, brilliant son. Patricia sneered at me, her chest heaving, as she tried to maintain her aristocratic posture, despite looking like a complete lunatic. We did save you. She spat her eyes wild with leftover hallucinogens and pure malice. You are nothing but a gold-digging parasite. Gavin is going to freeze your accounts, and you will be back on the streets where you belong. I tilted my head slightly, offering her a smile so cold it could have frozen the entire room. Gavin thought my trust fund was worth $5 million, I announced, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room where the hedge fund managers and corporate investors were hanging on to my every word. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of domestic chess to secure a modest payout. But his private investigators were incredibly cheap, and his financial comprehension is practically non-existent. I took another step closer, lowering my voice just enough to force Patricia to lean in. You thought my trust was worth $5 million, Patricia? I whispered my words, striking her like physical blows. It is actually $50 million. It always has been. I have possessed more wealth in a single hidden account than your entire extended family has seen in 3 generations. I never needed your son to save me. I was the one subsidizing this illusion of extreme wealth while you both bled yourselves dry at the baccarat tables. The color instantly drained from Patricia's face. The massive, unimaginable number hit her brain like a freight train. $50 million. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She looked over at Gavin, who was still being held by the federal agents, his wrists locked tightly in steel handcuffs. Gavin was staring at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated agony. He had poisoned his wife and ruined his life for a fraction of what I was actually worth. But I was not quite finished driving the final nail into their coffin. Having $50 million at my disposal gave me a lot of liquid capital. Patricia, I continued, my voice sharp and ruthless. And yesterday, while you were screaming at imaginary insects in a hospital bed, I put that capital to very good use. I had my brother-in-law reach out to the underground gambling syndicates in Macau and the casino bosses in Las Vegas. Patricia physically stumbled backward, her knees trembling as the reality of my words began to take shape. The men you and Gavin owe money to were starting to panic, I explained to the breathless room. When Kendrick informed them that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was seizing Gavin's assets, those violent loan sharks wanted out of the crosshairs of the United States government immediately. They wanted to liquidate their exposure. So my blind shell company, Vanguard Holdings, made them a very generous offer. We bought your paper. We bought out every single one of your gambling debts for pennies on the dollar. I let the absolute gravity of my financial maneuver sink into the minds of the elite crowd. The corporate lawyers and hedge fund managers in the room gasped aloud, instantly recognizing the sheer brilliance and sheer brutality of the trap I had sprung. Do you understand what that means, Patricia? I asked, my voice echoing with total final victory. I am not just your daughter-in-law anymore. I am your primary creditor. Vanguard Holdings legally owns your debt. I legally control every remaining asset you and your son have to your names. I own the title to your luxury cars. I own the contents of your bank accounts. I own the designer dress you are currently wearing. I own the remaining equity in your fraudulent charity foundation. Patricia began to shake violently. The aristocratic superiority she had weaponized against me for years was completely obliterated. She was not just going to federal prison. She was going to federal prison as a completely destitute, penniless beggar. You have absolutely nothing, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. You are worse than broke. You are entirely owned by the working-class girl from Queens. Gavin heard every single word from across the foyer. The realization that he had murdered his first wife, poisoned his second wife, committed massive federal fraud, and ended up completely owned by the very woman he tried to destroy, finally broke his mind into 1,000 jagged pieces. His greed had been his absolute undoing. With a guttural, blood-curdling roar of pure, desperate rage, Gavin snapped. He ignored the heavy steel handcuffs biting into his wrists. He ignored the federal agents surrounding him. Driven by pure, unhinged madness and the total loss of his financial empire, Gavin made a violent, desperate lunge directly at me, determined to physically tear me apart. He did not even make it 2 feet. The 3 federal agents flanking him moved with terrifying speed. They grabbed Gavin by the shoulders and the back of his tailored suit jacket, lifted him entirely off his feet, and brutally tackled him straight down onto the polished hardwood floor. The sound of Gavin striking the polished oak floor echoed like a heavy gunshot through the silent, vaulted living room. 3 heavily armored federal agents pinned him down instantly. One pressed a knee firmly between his shoulder blades, completely neutralizing his desperate, pathetic struggle. Gavin gasped for air, his cheek pressed flat against a puddle of spilled champagne and broken crystal. I did not move a single inch. I just looked down at him from my towering height, my crimson silk dress brushing lightly against his expensive, ruined leather shoes. A federal agent pulled Gavin's arms violently behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut, biting deep into his wrists with a sharp metallic snap. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead agent announced, his deep voice booming over the terrified whispers of the high society crowd. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Across the foyer, Patricia let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek as a female agent grabbed her arms. "Get your hands off me!" Patricia screamed, thrashing wildly in her wrinkled designer gown. "Do you know who I am? I am a pillar of this community. I host the Westchester Heritage Gala. You are making a massive mistake." The female agent ignored her completely, sweeping Patricia's arms behind her back and snapping a second pair of steel handcuffs onto her manicured wrists. "You are an embezzler and an attempted murderer," the agent replied coldly, marching her forward. "You have the right to an attorney." The federal agents hauled Gavin to his feet. The time had come for the ultimate crushing humiliation. The agents marched my husband and my mother-in-law straight down the center of the grand living room, initiating the most brutal perp walk this affluent suburb had ever witnessed. The crowd of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and powerful state politicians actively recoiled. They shrank back against the floral arrangements and the expensive modern artwork parting like the Red Sea. They looked at Gavin and Patricia with expressions of absolute, unfiltered disgust. Gavin kept his head down, sobbing openly, his tears mixing with the blood from his cut hands. He was entirely broken, stripped of his arrogant charm and his fake entrepreneurial glory. But Patricia fought all the way to the door. She looked desperately at a wealthy state senator she had been trying to court for months to secure board positions for her fake charities. "Tell them to stop," Patricia begged the politician, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "Tell them who we are. We belong here." The senator turned his back to her, entirely pretending she did not even exist. The total destruction of their social standing was absolute. They were no longer the elite rulers of Westchester. They were radioactive, toxic criminals, and nobody with that much offshore wealth wanted to be caught standing anywhere near a federal indictment. The heavy front doors swung open. The harsh glare of red and blue police lights flooded the entryway, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble foyer. The agents shoved Gavin and Patricia out into the freezing night air, marching them directly toward the waiting armored transport vehicles. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate completely. Inside the mansion, the spell was officially broken. The elite crowd immediately panicked. Nobody wanted to be the last person standing at the scene of a massive federal raid. The billionaires and corporate investors practically sprinted for the coat check room. They abandoned their expensive crystal flutes on the catering tables and rushed out the front doors, fleeing into the night as fast as their luxury vehicles could carry them. Within 20 minutes, the entire estate was completely empty. The hired catering staff quickly and quietly packed up their equipment, too terrified to ask for their final payment. I instructed the head caterer to send the invoice directly to my shell company, Vanguard Holdings, and they vanished out the back door without saying a single word. The massive $2.5 million Tudor mansion fell completely silent. The classical string quartet was gone. The frantic energy of the party was entirely erased. I stood in the center of the living room surrounded by abandoned cocktail napkins and overturned chairs. But the silence was not lonely. It was the most beautiful, victorious sound I had ever heard in my entire life. My sister Vanessa walked over to me, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. She wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, pulling me into a fierce, protective embrace. "We did it," Vanessa whispered, her voice thick with emotion and profound relief. "You actually took them down. You are safe now, Paige." Kendrick stepped up beside us, loosening his tailored tie for the first time all evening. The brilliant black former federal prosecutor looked around the empty room with a deeply satisfied expression. "The digital evidence has been fully secured by the agency," Kendrick announced, crossing his muscular arms over his broad chest. "Gavin will be sitting in a federal holding cell by midnight. Patricia will be transferred to a high-security medical lockup. With the sheer volume of financial crimes and the murder conspiracy charges we handed over, neither of them will ever see the outside of a prison wall again." I pulled away from Vanessa and looked at my brother-in-law. "Thank you, Kendrick," I said softly. "I could never have navigated the federal justice system without you." Kendrick smiled, a sharp, knowing look flashing in his dark eyes. "You built the cage, Paige. I just helped you lock the door." I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the dark, sprawling lawn. Just a few weeks ago, I had walked into this house believing I had the perfect marriage. I had blindly trusted a man who was actively crushing high-grade sedatives into my morning tea to steal my inheritance. I had smiled politely at a mother-in-law who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable working-class pawn. I had survived their psychological warfare, their financial traps, and their violent, murderous backup plans. I had turned every single weapon they possessed directly against them. Suddenly, a sharp, distinct vibration echoed from the concealed pocket of my crimson silk dress. I reached down and pulled out my secure smartphone. The screen illuminated the dark reflection of the window glass. It was a new text message. The sender was an unsaved, untraceable offshore phone number. I knew exactly who it was. It was the violent underground loan shark Gavin had begged for an extension just a few days ago, the men who held the massive gambling debts I had just secretly purchased. I swiped the screen open, my heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm. The message read, "Your husband's debt is clear. Pleasure doing business with Vanguard LLC." The glowing text message from the underground loan shark sat perfectly still on my secure smartphone screen. "Your husband's debt is clear. Pleasure doing business with Vanguard LLC." I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into the concealed pocket of my crimson silk dress. The air inside the empty $2.5 million Tudor mansion felt incredibly light. The suffocating presence of Gavin and his mother had been completely eradicated, scrubbed from the premises by the federal government. I looked at my sister Vanessa and my brother-in-law Kendrick. We did not need to celebrate with champagne or grand speeches. The absolute silence of the grand living room was our victory march. The next morning, the financial and social fallout was absolute and totally catastrophic. The news of the FBI raid at the Westchester estate hit every major publication and financial blog in New York before the stock market even opened. The headlines were brutal, painting Gavin as a fraudulent, violent predator and Patricia as a high society embezzler who stole from the city's most vulnerable charities. Their reputation was not just damaged, it was vaporized. Gavin and Patricia were immediately denied bail. Kendrick had explicitly highlighted Gavin's offshore connections and the violent nature of his crimes to the federal judge, effectively labeling my husband an extreme flight risk and a severe danger to the community. They were locked in federal holding cells, stripped of their tailored suits and designer dresses, forced to wear standard-issue orange jumpsuits. With all of Gavin's assets completely frozen by the federal government or legally owned by my blind shell company, he could not afford the high-powered corporate defense attorneys he so desperately needed. His former business partners refused to take his calls. His investors rushed to cooperate with the authorities to save their own skins. Gavin was assigned a severely overworked public defender who took one look at the mountain of digital evidence Kendrick had handed over and immediately advised him to surrender. The legal process moved with terrifying mechanical speed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had the high-definition hidden camera footage of the poisoning. They had the crisp audio recordings of Gavin plotting to lock me in a psychiatric facility to steal my $50 million trust fund. They had the forged hard money loan documents proving aggravated mortgage fraud. But the most devastating weapon in the prosecutor's arsenal was the cheap prepaid burner phone I had pulled from Gavin's biometric safe. The text messages outlining the contract killing of his first wife were undeniable. The mechanic who had cut the brake lines was tracked down and arrested within 48 hours. Facing his own massive prison sentence, the mechanic immediately flipped, providing a full recorded confession that completely tied Gavin to the premeditated assassination. Faced with a guaranteed life sentence for conspiracy to commit murder across state lines, Gavin's arrogant, manipulative spirit finally broke in half. Standing in the sterile, fluorescent-lit federal courtroom, wearing handcuffs and a heavy waist chain, my husband accepted a brutal plea deal. He pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud, attempted poisoning, and the murder conspiracy. The judge slammed the heavy wooden gavel down, sentencing Gavin to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Patricia's fate was equally devastating. She tried to play the role of a frail, confused elderly woman who had been manipulated by her domineering son. But the federal prosecutors played the hidden camera video of her intentionally and gleefully dumping high-grade hallucinogens into my champagne glass at the charity gala. Then they projected the financial ledgers I had extracted from the hidden USB drive in her lipstick tube. The courtroom watched as the numbers proved she had systematically stolen millions of dollars from her own Heritage Charity Foundation to fund Gavin's underground gambling addiction. The judge was completely disgusted. Patricia was officially stripped of every single remaining asset she possessed to pay federal restitution to the nonprofit organization. Her luxury vehicles, her jewelry, and her bank accounts were seized and auctioned off by the government. She was sentenced to 8 years in a federal women's correctional facility. The untouchable Westchester socialite was reduced to a penniless federal inmate forced to spend her twilight years eating cafeteria food off a plastic tray. 6 months after the judge delivered their sentences, I drove my car to the maximum security federal penitentiary located in upstate New York. I did not wear a powerful crimson gown this time. I wore a sharp, tailored black business suit, looking exactly like the formidable forensic accountant I truly was. I walked through the heavy, reinforced steel security doors and sat down in the bleak, colorless visitor room. I waited patiently in front of a thick pane of bulletproof safety glass. A few minutes later, the heavy door on the opposite side of the room buzzed open. 2 armed guards escorted Gavin into the visiting booth. He looked incredibly aged. His face was gaunt, his skin carried a sickly gray pallor, and his hair was buzzed incredibly short. The charismatic, wealthy entrepreneur I had met at a charity gala 3 years ago was completely gone. He sat down heavily on the metal stool, picking up the black plastic telephone receiver attached to the wall. He looked at me through the thick glass, his eyes wide and burning with a mixture of desperate hope and deeply rooted hatred. He thought I had come to gloat. He thought I had come to ask him why he did it, to seek some kind of emotional closure or tearful apology. He still thought he possessed some level of psychological power over my emotions. I did not pick up the telephone receiver. I did not want to hear his voice, and I had absolutely nothing to say to him. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I slid the envelope smoothly through the narrow metal exchange slot located at the bottom of the safety glass. Gavin set the telephone receiver down and picked up the envelope with trembling, chained hands. He pulled the thick stack of legal documents out into the harsh, fluorescent light. The first document was our finalized divorce decree, signed, sealed, and executed by a family court judge. The second stack of papers was his completed absolute bankruptcy filing. The documents legally verified that Vanguard Holdings had absorbed and liquidated his remaining debts, leaving his personal net worth at an absolute zero. He was officially a divorced, completely destitute, and penniless felon. Gavin stared at the papers, the brutal, undeniable reality of his total annihilation finally sinking into his brain. His hands began to shake violently. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his fists brutally against the bulletproof glass, screaming obscenities that I could barely hear through the thick, soundproof barrier. His face turned bright red as he thrashed against his restraints. I sat there for exactly 5 seconds watching him completely lose his mind. Then I offered him a cold, polite, and victorious smile. I stood up from the metal stool, picked up my leather briefcase, and turned my back on him entirely. I walked out of the visitor room, the heavy steel doors clicking shut behind me, leaving his muffled screams echoing pointlessly behind the glass. I walked out of that federal penitentiary into the freezing, bright New York morning. The heavy steel security doors clicked shut behind me, locking my ex-husband inside a concrete cage for the next 15 years. The sound signaled the absolute end of the darkest, most terrifying chapter of my life. I did not look back at the prison walls. I walked directly to my car, slid behind the wheel, and drove back toward the city, feeling the crushing weight of the past 3 years finally lift completely off my shoulders. The very next morning, my blind shell company Vanguard Holdings officially listed the $2.5 million Tudor mansion in Westchester on the open real estate market. Because of the recent media frenzy surrounding the dramatic federal raid, the property had ironically gained a massive amount of high society notoriety. I sold it to a foreign tech billionaire for an all-cash offer of $4.2 million, walking away with a staggering, immaculate profit. I took the forged mortgage documents, the offshore gambling ledgers, and every single material reminder of Gavin and Patricia, and I threw them into a heavy metal incinerator. I was entirely done hiding in the shadows. For years, I had kept my $50 million inheritance locked away in secret, heavily encrypted accounts. I had been terrified that revealing my true wealth would attract financial predators, but trying to play the naive working-class girl from Queens had only made me a target for a different kind of monster. I decided right then that I would never shrink myself to make someone else comfortable ever again. I bought a stunning, ultra-modern penthouse overlooking Central Park. I vastly expanded my forensic accounting firm, hiring a team of ruthless, brilliant financial analysts who specialized in tracking offshore corporate fraud and uncovering hidden marital assets for women going through high-stakes divorces. 6 months after Gavin and Patricia were permanently locked behind federal bars, I hosted a private, joyous celebration in my new penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline glittering against the night sky. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly light, warm, and entirely safe. My sister Vanessa arrived wearing a vibrant emerald green dress, looking happier and more relaxed than I had seen her in a decade. Kendrick walked in right behind her, his imposing frame clad in a sharp, tailored navy suit. The brilliant black former federal prosecutor handed me an expensive bottle of vintage wine, his dark eyes shining with genuine pride. We were no longer fighting federal legal battles or dismantling violent crime syndicates. We were finally just family enjoying the peace we had fought so viciously to secure. A few minutes later, the private elevator chimed smoothly, and Beatrice stepped directly into my bright foyer. The sharp-witted 65-year-old widow had driven into the city from the suburbs just for this dinner. I walked over and pulled her into a tight, incredibly grateful embrace. Without Beatrice making that frantic phone call and saving that hidden camera footage, I would have ended up heavily sedated in a locked psychiatric ward, while my husband liquidated my entire existence. She was not just a former homeowner anymore. She was the woman who had handed me the exact weapon I needed to save my own life. We sat around my massive marble dining table sharing a lavish multi-course meal prepared by a private chef. The conversation flowed easily, completely devoid of the toxic walking on eggshells tension that used to define my dinners with Patricia. We laughed about the absolute absurdity of Patricia attempting to spike my drink at the charity gala, only to accidentally poison herself and hallucinate in front of the entire state senate. We toasted to Kendrick's flawless execution of the federal legal traps, his brilliant legal mind having ensured that Gavin's fraudulent mortgage blew up spectacularly. We celebrated Vanessa's unwavering loyalty, her fierce protection giving me the strength to maintain my cover when my sanity was being actively attacked. As the plates were cleared away and the city lights burned brightly outside the glass, I did not reach for a crystal flute of expensive champagne. Instead, I walked over to the kitchen island and poured myself a steaming, fragrant mug of pure chamomile tea. I walked back to the dining table and stood at the head of it. I held the warm ceramic mug in my hands, breathing in the clean, natural, earthy scent. There was no bitter metallic undertone. There was no hidden poison. There was only pure, unadulterated peace. I raised my mug toward my sister, my brother-in-law, and the brave widow who had saved me. I looked at their smiling faces, and then I looked out at the sprawling, limitless city below us. Society teaches women to be accommodating, to be quiet, and to immediately doubt our own instincts when powerful, charismatic people tell us we are wrong. We are constantly conditioned to shrink ourselves, to hand over our financial independence in the name of love, and to question our own sanity the second a manipulative partner tells us our memory is failing. Gavin and Patricia thought my working-class background made me stupid. They thought my quiet demeanor meant I was weak and easily controlled. They thought they could drug my tea, forge my signature, and steal my inheritance without me ever fighting back. They made the fatal, catastrophic mistake of underestimating a woman who knows her exact worth and understands every single number on a balance sheet. True power does not come from screaming the loudest or throwing dirty money around to impress strangers at a country club. True power comes from absolute financial independence, unbreakable family loyalty, and a razor-sharp mind that utterly refuses to be gaslit. I survived a predator because I trusted cold, hard data over sweet, poisonous lies. Never let anyone convince you that you're losing your mind, especially when you're the only one who truly understands the game. The story of Alyssa and the warehouse teaches a powerful lesson about recognizing your own intrinsic value, even when those closest to you fail to see it. Her family constantly underestimated her abilities and prioritized her brother over her, culminating in a devastating betrayal. However, instead of folding under their manipulation, she used her inheritance as a catalyst for absolute independence. She ultimately proved that true worth is not determined by the approval of others, but by your own vision and resilience. Have you ever had to stand up against family betrayal to protect your future? Comment your thoughts below.